Now we're talking to Alex Martini, the author of a new book called Tracks, Racing of the Sun, talking about the legendary figures of early days of motor car racing. How are you, Alex?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
No, thank you for your time, and thank you for bringing back these memories. I mean, fascinating people that most people now have forgotten, I guess, huh?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, although there's still a little bit of fascination in the old days, but yes, absolutely. A lot of people have forgotten that there was Grand Prix racing before Formula One racing, and so they built the foundation of what we see today.
Yeah. So the book is based in the era between 1934 and 45. Pretty turbulent times in Europe, no?
Yes, exactly. It's pre-war, so it's basically mostly to do with the Italians, the Alfa Romeo and the Mercedes-Benz and the auto unions and the German and the Italian drivers at the time, who were sort of the biggest guys around the world at that stage.
Yeah, it must have been a a lot of work. I mean, very detailed work to research all this because where did you find out all about all the documents and everything about these people?
Yeah, the research was actually quite fascinating. It took me about a decade to do because most of the information is firstly in Italian and German, because in those days they ruled the roost, and more than that, of course, is because it was during the time of the Nazis and the fascists. A lot of the information was sort of given in a way that was meant to, it was basically propaganda. So trying to find out actually what was happening as opposed to what they were saying was happening was one of the more interesting things. For instance, Achille Valzi was, in 1936, he ended up being a morphine addict. But at the time, they didn't actually say that. What they said was, he was a little bit sick. So there was a lot of stuff hidden in the background. And of course, there aren't a lot of biographies or even autobiographies. A lot of the guys don't actually write. And so a lot of the information was very difficult to find. But once you actually start finding out the information, it was the most fascinating project, I must say.
Excellent. So, what inspired you to write this book exactly?
Well, the inspiration, funny enough, came from an article that I read actually on I think it was Motor Racing magazine back in 2001 or 2002, and it basically touched on Achille Valzi's morphine habits and this woman that he fell in love with, this German woman, and I just thought the story was really fascinating, and I came back to New York and I did a bit of research and I realized that actually nobody sort of knew what happened to the woman to begin with. She kind of just disappeared. And the whole addiction thing was sort of not really known about in English-speaking circles because actually the only biography ever written about Valzi was in Italian. It was a very small book that was written in 1992.
Yeah.
And the more I went into it, the more I thought, this is really fascinating. And it became a sort of a quest to find out what happened to the woman that he fell in love with, who apparently turned him on to morphine and made him into a drug addict. And, it was the whole Nazis and the fascists. It was so fascinating. The more I sort of explored, the more questions I had to answer for myself. So
yeah, like happens with like it happens with everything, right? The more we know, the more we find out we don't know much about things.
Correct. Yeah, the more answers we find, and the more questions actually come up from the answers. That's exactly right. Yes.
Yeah. So, what are some of the personalities that you discover in your research for the book?
Well, the personalities I focused on four of the biggest drivers of that era, because I guess the book just lent itself to. The book started off as a project on Valzi, and these other characters sort of came into it, and I sort of got so fascinated. So you have Tazio Nuvolari, who was fascist Italy's great icon. He was, the guy that had no fear. He literally had no fear.
Yeah.
He would just have these massive accidents and just walk away and just keep driving. And basically wanted to die on the racetrack and actually never got around to it. And then you had the Germans. A guy called Rudy Caracciolo, who, despite having an Italian name, was actually completely German, and he actually used to, he's one of the big drivers of the time, who actually used to hand deliver Adolf Hitler's Mercedes-Benz. He used to actually hand deliver them because that was kind of his job, as opposed to actually being like a great driver, right?
Wow. And
of course there was Bernd Rosemeyer, who was this very young guy, this 25-year-old guy who was the Nazis' ideal man at the time, of course, because he was the Aryan wonder, blue-eyed and blonde-haired, and the member of the SS and whatever. And he was sort of promoted into the old auto union team and sort of Hitler's youth. He was the ideal of the Hitler youth. And of course, when he died in 38, going faster than any man in the world, his propaganda value became so important to the Nazis because they were preparing, obviously, for the war, and they wanted these kids to sort of look at this guy and say, well, look how he died for the glory of the Reich and of the Nazi Empire, and all kids should sort of emulate what this guy did. So his death was kind of the best case scenario for the Nazis. And it was really quite fascinating because he himself was not a Nazi. He himself actually was very uncomfortable being this thing. But in those days, if you wanted to be a motor racing driver, you had to toe the party line.
You pretty much agree. So there were politics in auto racing back then too, like today.
There was, of course, there was huge politics in motor racing back then. In fact, the whole German teams, both Auto Union and Mercedes-Benz, were completely funded by the Nazi Party as a way of to be a propaganda vehicle for Nazi Germany and the whole ideal of, Aryan manhood or whatever. But on top of that, it was also a way for them to find out technological advancements because they couldn't actually make ammunition or arms or tanks or anything else because they'd obviously lost World War I in the Treaty of Versailles. So for them, in order to actually militarize and to learn technological processes like the engines and the lubricants and the oils or whatever, they went into motor racing.
Yeah.
And that was a legal way for them to actually make a lot of the engines that were actually in the German cars and also the Italian cars were used in the fighter jets, the fighter planes in the Second World War.
And what about the actual? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about the engines. What kind of horsepower, kind of things? What kind of cars they were driving in these days?
Right. Well, that's actually the fascinating part, is because a lot of people sort of look back and they think, 1930s, there must have been these old little slow cars. These cars at one point, towards the 1937, 1938, were producing about 600, 700.
Wow, big cars.
I mean, exactly. I mean, the fastest man in the history of road on a public road is Rudy Caracciola. He did it in 1938 at 430 kilometers an hour. And no one has beaten that record to this day. It still stands.
That's amazing.
These cars were incredibly fast.
So,
and you're only talking about, they weighed 800 kilos and so typically on a road course, I mean, they didn't race on real tracks. They raced on public roads. And, at Pescara, for instance, this road race in Italy, they would reach 370, 380 kilometers an hour.
Yeah, and nothing to compare with safety measures like today. I mean, there must have been a lot of pretty bad accidents back then, I guess. I don't know.
Absolutely. I mean, if you had an accident in those days, chances are something bad would have happened. In other words, you would either be maimed or killed. And actually, there was the dying rate, or in terms of the racing drivers, was actually higher than they did in the World War I flying races. It was a hugely dangerous sport. I mean, no safety belts, no helmets, no crash barriers. If you went off, you went into the trees.
Yeah, I once had the opportunity to go to the Mercedes-Benz design center, classic center, in Stuttgart, and I saw some of these cars, and they were like pretty much thin cans with wheels and the engine. I mean, they're on a seat. That was it.
Absolutely. I mean, the Auto Union, which was actually designed by Porsche, who obviously went on to make the Porsche.
Yeah.
He designed this car. The skin of the car was actually made of aluminum. If you actually pressed it with your finger, you could actually dent the skin of these cars. That's how light they were.
And they were running over 300 kilometers, which is like 250 miles an hour. Amazing.
250 miles per hour, exactly. And the reason, when you see the old photographs of these guys holding these big steering wheels, the reason why they had the big steering wheels is not because they didn't know about small steering wheels. It's because holding onto these steering wheels is the only way they were keeping themselves into the car. Because they didn't actually want anything to keep them in the car if they had an accident, because flying out of their car, like in motorbikes, was actually the best way for them to actually survive an accident, because inside the car they had no chance, because these cars were made basically, they were just so flimsy.
So that was the protection a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, they were crazy guys. I mean, incredibly brave.
Yeah.
I mean, incredible. But, in those days, life was not quite as precious as it is today. Especially for the fascists and the Nazis, they kind of had an ideal that sacrifice was what people just kind of did.
Yeah, indeed, a very fascinating book. Alex, so can you tell us a little bit about you and where can our audience can find your book?
Right. Well, me myself, I live up in Irvington, New York, and I do a lot of editing, and this is my first non-fiction, historical fiction book.
And have you written about motor racing before? This is the first take at that.
Yes, I've written a lot of articles and magazine articles, etc. But this is my first book on motor racing.
So where can we find it? It's everywhere, like electronically and all that?
It's available everywhere, Amazon or Barnes & Noble, wherever you want, and it'll be available on September the 9th in the US, and it's actually out now in the UK and Australia.
So Trucks Racing the Sun by Alex Martini. I'm sorry. Well, fascinating book. Thank you very much for taking the time. And one last question: what's your opinion about the modern motor racing compared to the days featured in the book?
Well, it's changed a lot, hasn't it? I mean, nowadays we have. I think the biggest difference is in terms of safety. I don't think that the audience can stomach people getting hurt anymore or dying on racetracks, and so racing has become far more safe. I think because it's become more safe, racing has actually changed because a lot of what made a great racing driver in the 1930s and until the 1970s was the courage and the ability to push themselves over what I think most people can do. Whereas nowadays, modern racing cars are actually safer than your road-going car. So you as a driver going on your motorway probably stand more of a chance of getting hurt than modern racing drivers. Whereas in the 1930s, the 1940s, etc., the difference was that the chances of you getting hurt was far more higher. And I think that's the fundamental difference in racing. Otherwise, it still stays the same. Certain people can do it and certain people can't.
Even though a lot of us want to do it.
Well, yes, most of us would like to become racing drivers, but in the end, there's only a certain amount of people that have the ability to do it because it's about balance, and there are just so many, different elements that actually make a person into a racing driver. And I think most of us can probably think that we can drive well, but if you've ever actually gone onto a racetrack or a kart track with a real racing driver, you realize that they have an ability which most of us just don't have.
Yeah.
It's just a natural ability, and that's it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I actually have experienced that. So thank you very much again for your time, Alex, and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.